The clang of the cell door echoed in my ears as I stared at the cold, unyielding walls of Straubing prison. Convicted of a crime I didn't commit, I found myself trapped within this Bavarian fortress, my pleas of innocence falling on deaf ears. Each day behind bars only intensified my resolve to escape and clear my name. Straubing prison, with its towering stone walls and vigilant watchtowers, was designed to be inescapable. But as a former civil engineer, I couldn't help but analyze the prison's infrastructure, searching for any weakness. I observed the routines of the guards, the maintenance schedules, and the structural nuances of the facility. It was during these observations that I noticed a potential flaw. A section of the eastern perimeter wall, partially obscured by an ancient oak tree, showed signs of water damage. In the evenings, I played chess with Klaus, an elderly inmate and former locksmith. Our games were more than a pastime, they were lessons in patience, strategy, and the art of manipulation. Klaus shared stories of his past, detailing the intricacies of locks and security systems. His knowledge became invaluable as I began to formulate a plan. One rainy afternoon, while inmates milled about the yard, I watched the maintenance crew assess the damaged wall. Their discussions revealed that repairs were scheduled but not immediate. Time was of the essence. I confided in Klaus, sharing my observations and my desire to escape. He listened intently, his weathered face revealing a mix of concern and intrigue. "If you're serious about this," Klaus whispered during one of our games, "you'll need more than just a plan. You'll need resources and a way to disappear once you're out." He told me about Joseph, a contact on the outside who specialized in forging documents and providing safe passage for those in need. Reaching Joseph would be crucial. With Klaus's guidance, I began to gather supplies: a length of sturdy rope, a small chisel, and a makeshift grappling hook fashioned from a metal coat hanger. Each item was acquired discreetly, hidden away until the time was right. As days turned into weeks, the damaged wall continued to deteriorate, the relentless rain weakening its structure further. The guards remained oblivious, their routines unchanged. I knew the window of opportunity was narrow. With my plan in place and determination burning within me, I prepared for the most daring endeavor of my life, escaping Straubing prison to reclaim my freedom and prove my innocence. They say silence in prison is never truly silent. There's always the low hum of desperation, the shuffle of restless feet, or the distant echo of steel clashing on steel. But that night was different. The air itself felt heavier, thicker with the weight of what I was about to attempt. I waited until 2 a.m., when the prison's pulse slowed into its deepest lull. The guards' rotations, which I had memorized down to the second, offered me a narrow window. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, that breaking out was impossible. But fear had long since evolved into determination. I reached beneath the frame of my bed and retrieved the crude tools I had hidden there. The chisel Klaus had helped me sharpen from an old piece of cutlery, the rope I'd woven from bed sheets and discarded clothing, and the makeshift grappling hook, a coat hanger twisted into an unlikely savior. Every item had its place, each step practiced 100 times over in my mind. The cell door's lock was the first challenge. Klaus had taught me how to listen, how to feel the mechanism's subtle clicks through vibrations in the metal. My pulse hammered in my ears as I worked, turning the improvised pick with painstaking precision. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes, but then, click. The bolt slid back, and the door eased open with barely a sound. The hallway was dimly lit, bathed in a sickly orange glow from the emergency lights. My footsteps were slow, measured, blending with the ambient groans of old pipes and the far-off coughs of inmates deep in restless sleep. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every creak of the floor threatened to betray me. I bypassed the main corridors, sticking instead to the maintenance tunnels that ran like veins beneath the prison's skin. It wasn't just luck that I knew about them. My days as a civil engineer had taught me to read buildings like stories written in steel and concrete. These service passages were older, forgotten by most, but still necessary for power lines and water pipes. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the door that led out into the courtyard adjacent to the compromised wall. The door was old, its hinges rusted from years of rain and neglect. A deep breath. I applied just enough pressure to push it open without drawing attention, the hinges protesting softly, barely audible above the wind whispering through the trees outside. The cold night air hit me like a reminder, this was real now. Failure meant more than getting caught, it meant losing everything. I stuck to the shadows, keeping low and moving along the edges of the courtyard. The guards' patrols followed a predictable loop, giving me precious minutes before someone would round the corner. The oak tree near the wall loomed above me, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers under the starless sky. At last, I reached the wall. The repairs were as rushed as I had suspected. The mortar between the stones was fresh but shallow, and rain had already begun to eat away at the weaker patches. I pulled out the chisel and set to work, scraping away the soft mortar with deliberate, quiet strokes. Each piece of loosened stone brought me closer to freedom, and closer to the point of no return. My fingers bled, the chill biting through my skin as I worked faster. Minutes passed like lifetimes. Then, finally, I had cleared enough space to pry out a brick, then another. One by one, the stones fell away until the gap was just wide enough for me to squeeze through. The rope came next. I secured the grappling hook to the nearest outcropping and pulled it tight, testing the weight. One slip, and I'd be left dangling for the guards to find. My heart pounded against my ribs as I climbed, muscles screaming with every movement until I reached the top of the wall. From there, the world outside looked unreal, fog curling across the open field beyond, the Danube River shimmering faintly in the distance. But I wasn't free yet. Dropping down from the wall was its own risk. I let the rope slide through my fingers slowly, lowering myself with all the control I could muster until my feet touched solid ground. I allowed myself one deep breath. Then I ran. The field was slick with dew, every step sinking into soft earth. I moved with the desperation of a man who knew how short-lived this freedom could be. The searchlights from the towers carved through the darkness behind me, sweeping the grounds with cold precision. One wrong move, 1 second too slow, and the alarms would wail through the night. The Danube was closer now, maybe 2 kilometers away. The river was more than just a route, it was a symbol of escape, a promise of movement beyond these stone walls. But reaching it would mean navigating past one final obstacle, the outer perimeter fence. Electrified and topped with razor wire, it was the last testament to the prison's claim of being unbreachable. I crouched behind a patch of wild grass, catching my breath as I scanned the fence for any sign of weakness. Then I saw it, a drainage ditch running beneath the lowest section, covered by a rusted grate. The opening was narrow, barely large enough for a person to fit through. No time for second thoughts. I sprinted to the ditch, pulling the grate with every ounce of strength I had left. It groaned under the strain but finally gave way, revealing a muddy tunnel beneath. I slid in head first, the cold muck sucking at my clothes as I wriggled forward, inch by agonizing inch. The light from the prison faded behind me, replaced by the promise of freedom ahead. When I emerged, gasping for air on the other side of the fence, I didn't stop running until the Danube's cold waters touched my feet. I had made it out of Straubing prison. But the escape was only half the battle. The Danube's water was colder than I had anticipated, biting into my skin as if to remind me that I was not yet free. Every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins wouldn't let me stop. I waded in slowly at first, careful to avoid making too much noise. The prison lights were still visible behind me, flickering faintly like distant stars, but every second out here was a gamble. I moved along the shoreline, chest deep in the current, letting the river pull me south. My goal was simple: put as much distance between myself and Straubing prison as quickly as possible. The water offered cover and a natural trail to throw off any search dogs. The current was sluggish, but it worked to my advantage. If I didn't fight it, I could conserve precious energy. Hours seemed to pass in fragments, broken only by the sound of distant engines or the occasional flicker of a searchlight slicing through the treetops along the riverbank. Every noise sent a fresh spike of fear through my chest, but nothing came close. Not yet. When dawn began to break, painting the sky in pale streaks of orange and gray, I finally dragged myself onto the bank. I was freezing, soaked to the bone, and too exhausted to move another inch. My hands trembled as I pulled myself into a thicket of reeds, curling into a ball beneath a tangle of underbrush. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of wind in the trees, every bird call jolted me back to full awareness. But my body couldn't take much more. Eventually, exhaustion won, and the darkness behind my eyelids was the most peaceful thing I'd known in years. When I woke, the sun was high, casting harsh light through the trees. I had no way of knowing how long I'd been asleep, an hour, maybe 2. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I ignored it. First, I needed to reach Joseph, Klaus's contact. The old man had given me clear instructions before I left. Head south along the river. Near Regensburg, there's a bridge with a rusted iron support. Beneath it, you'll find a mark, a cross carved into the metal. That's the meeting point. Joseph will find you there. I forced myself to stand, every joint stiff from cold and overuse. The city of Regensburg wasn't far, maybe 30 kilometers by foot, but with no money, no food, and no identity, every step could be my last as a free man. I stayed off the main roads, sticking instead to the cover of forests and fields. My soaked clothes dried stiff on my body as the day wore on, adding to the discomfort. Twice, I heard the distant sound of helicopters overhead, no doubt searching the countryside for any sign of me. By nightfall, I had made it halfway, following the river's lazy bends. I drank directly from the Danube, ignoring the bitter taste. Hunger clawed deeper now, but I couldn't risk being seen scavenging from nearby towns. The fear of capture was stronger than any craving for food. The second night was colder than the first, and sleep came in restless bursts. I dreamed of steel walls and locked doors, of guards dragging me back through the gates of Straubing. Every time I woke, my heart was pounding in my throat. On the third day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally saw the outline of Regensburg in the distance. Its old stone buildings and bridges stood silhouetted against the dying light. I quickened my pace, desperation giving me a final surge of strength. The bridge Klaus had spoken of was easy to find, an old railway overpass, its iron supports rusted and worn. I scrambled down the embankment, searching for the mark beneath the bridge. There it was, a small cross, carved into the metal with a blade. I crouched beneath the overpass, shivering as the night's chill began to creep in again. Hours passed. I was beginning to think Klaus's contact had abandoned me when I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze. A shadow moved at the edge of the bridge. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple jacket and a worn cap. His face was obscured by the darkness. "You Marcus?" The voice was low, cautious. I hesitated, my throat dry. "Who's asking?" "Klaus sent me." Relief washed over me so fast it nearly brought me to my knees. I nodded, stepping out from my hiding place. Without another word, the man gestured for me to follow. No time for introductions. "They're close. We need to move." And just like that, my fight for freedom entered a deadlier phase. We didn't speak as we moved. The man, Joseph, I assumed, kept a brisk pace, his eyes scanning the shadows like a hawk on the hunt. Every so often, he'd glance back, checking if I was still with him. My legs burned, my lungs begged for rest, but I didn't dare slow down. We wove through the outskirts of Regensburg, avoiding the main streets and slipping between alleyways. The city's familiar hum was a stark reminder of how close I was to being dragged back into that concrete cage. I caught glimpses of normal life, cars passing by, laughter spilling from open windows, the glow of street lamps. Each moment a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. Finally, Joseph led me to a nondescript door set into the side of a crumbling brick warehouse. Without knocking, he produced a key and turned the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. "In," he said. I didn't hesitate. The air grew colder as we descended, the sound of the outside world fading until all I could hear was the thud of my heart in my ears. We emerged into a dimly lit basement, bare concrete walls, a single bulb swinging overhead, and a folding table cluttered with papers, a map of Germany, and what looked like forged documents. Joseph shut the door behind us and finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "Klaus said you'd be desperate, but this? You're either brave or stupid." "Maybe both," I managed. He snorted. "You're lucky I owe him. Most wouldn't risk this kind of heat." He sat across from me, steepling his fingers. "Listen carefully. You've made it out, but Germany's small, and Straubing won't stop hunting. Every cop from here to Berlin will have your face by morning. You need a new identity, and that takes time." "How much time?" 3 days, if I rush it." 3 days. It might as well have been a lifetime. Where do I lay low until then? Joseph's eyes narrowed. "You'll stay here. No going outside, no making noise. You move when I tell you to move. If anyone finds you, we're both dead." I nodded, swallowing my fear. The next 2 days passed in a haze of anxiety and restless pacing. I barely slept, haunted by the thought of guards crashing through the door, dragging me back in chains. Joseph worked tirelessly, crafting my new identity, new papers, a new name, Lucas Gruber, a truck driver from Dresden. On the third night, as promised, Joseph handed me a small envelope containing my new life. "You leave at dawn. A train station south of here. Tickets already bought. Get to Austria, after that, you're on your own." "Why help me?" I asked. He paused, the shadows playing across his face. "Klaus saved my life once. I'm returning the favor." I nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You've got a long way to go." That night, I didn't sleep. I waited, clutching the forged documents like a lifeline, listening to every creak of the floor above. By the time dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, I was ready. Joseph handed me a small bag of supplies, enough food for a few days, a little cash, and a burner phone. "Move fast. Trust no one." I slipped out into the cold morning, keeping my head down and my steps quick. The train station loomed ahead, its dull lights cutting through the fog. Every person I passed felt like a threat, every glance a possible betrayal. I bought a cup of stale coffee, waiting for my train as casually as I could. Then, over the loudspeaker. "Attention, all passengers. Be advised, police presence has increased due to ongoing security operations. Please have identification ready." Panic clawed at my chest. I couldn't run now, any sudden move would draw attention. I forced myself to breathe, sipping the bitter coffee to keep my hands steady. The train arrived. As I stepped aboard, my eyes met a pair of uniformed officers scanning the crowd at the platform. I turned my face toward the window and took a seat. The train doors slid shut. The engine hummed to life. The city began to blur past the glass. I didn't exhale until the platform disappeared from view. But even then, I knew, I wasn't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels should have been calming, but every second felt like borrowed time. I stared out the window, watching the German countryside roll past in streaks of green and gray. My reflection in the glass was almost unrecognizable, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man running from ghosts that never seemed far behind. Every time the train slowed, my heart lurched. Was this the stop where they'd catch me? Would the doors slide open, and a flood of uniformed officers pour in, their eyes scanning faces until they locked onto mine? But the train kept moving. I clutched my new passport, Lucas Gruber, so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Joseph's voice echoed in my mind, "Trust no one." And I didn't. I kept my head down, avoided eye contact, and rehearsed my cover story until it became second nature. As the Austrian border approached, tension coiled in my gut like a spring ready to snap. The train conductor's voice announced the final stretch before the crossing. Soon, customs officers would board for inspection. I knew the procedures: random ID checks, a few casual questions. For most travelers, it was routine. For me, it was life or death. The officers entered my car just after the final checkpoint announcement. Two of them moved slowly down the aisle, stopping at every row. I focused on my breathing, steady, even, unremarkable. "Papers, please," one officer said, his voice sharp but tired. I handed him my forged ID with what I hoped was the right balance of casual indifference and mild annoyance. His eyes scanned the document, then flicked briefly to my face. Those few seconds stretched into eternity. "What's your reason for travel, Mr. Gruber?" "Visiting family in Vienna," I replied, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. He gave a curt nod and moved on. I didn't dare breathe until the officers exited the car at the next stop. The Austrian countryside outside was my first sign of real hope. But escape didn't mean freedom, not yet. When the train finally pulled into Vienna's Hauptbahnhof station, I slipped off quietly, blending into the sea of passengers. My instructions from Joseph were clear: get to a safe house, lay low for at least a week, then disappear entirely. Eastern Europe would be my next stop, Romania, perhaps, or maybe Bulgaria. Somewhere with looser borders and fewer questions. Navigating through the station, I caught sight of a newsstand. My face was there, plastered across the front page of every paper in bold black letters. Straubing prison escapee at large, manhunt expands across borders. My stomach twisted. I was a ghost in the system, but the world hadn't forgotten me. I kept my hood up and my head low as I made my way to a quiet cafe near the edge of the city. I used a burner phone to send a single, coded message to Joseph: "Package delivered." No response came. That was the plan. The safe house was a nondescript apartment on the outskirts of Vienna. Inside, it was bare, no personal touches, no traces of who had been there before me. It wasn't home, but it was shelter. I locked the door behind me, drew the blinds, and collapsed onto the floor. For the first time since scaling that wall in Straubing, I let myself believe I might actually make it. But survival wasn't victory. The manhunt would cool eventually, but I knew better than to believe I could ever fully outrun it. My name, my face, it was all burned into databases and memories I couldn't erase. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city's quiet pulse through thin walls. I was free. But at what cost? The true escape was still ahead of me.